So I think it's a little bit unfair that I'm at the end of the day after a cocktail party, but the cocktail party meant that I got to speak to some of you, and that actually introduced me to some of the questions that you have, and hopefully I'll be able to answer some of them for you today. So I work as head of social media for City in Australia and New Zealand, and what that means is that I'm responsible for the reputation, for the management of the brand, the protection of our reputation, and for amplifying our brand as well across our whole franchise. It's very unique in City. I sit in City Australia, and it means that I can cross marketing, servicing, PR, thought leadership across the whole spectrum. For today, I'll be talking about the PR function because that's where I sit. So a little bit about me. Barry mentioned that I worked at Channel 9, and I did. And the way that I fell into social media listening was somewhat intuitive and accidental. I'd only been there for a couple of days or couple of weeks, and I walked in one morning and said that we would win the ratings based on an election coverage the night before. And I was almost laughed out of the office because we hadn't won any ratings for election coverage over the previous few years. About 20 minutes later, I got called in by the marketing director, and she said we'd won. So a full 12 hours before the official results were in, I knew that we would win. She asked me how, and I said Twitter. And she asked me what Twitter was, because this was 2010. So what happened is that I was sitting at home. I'm not a TV watcher, but I am a social media advocate, early adopter. I was watching people switch channels. They were talking about watching the election on one network, and then it became talking about watching the election on Channel 9. What that resulted in was channel switching behaviour and a ratings win for 9. As a result of that, I was offered the role of doing our social media strategy, which I did. Proud to say that we did exceptionally well, and all of that was because of listening. What we could do is directly correlate ratings to conversations online. Obviously, I've been hooked ever since. I went from media to banking. Might be surprising for some of you that I did that, but I did. And it was interesting because no longer were we talking about ratings, we were talking about customer experience and thought leadership, customer transactions, community partners, but we had the same objective, and that was to make sure that people knew about us and were listening to the stories that we had to say. Not that long ago, our media analyst, our partner at City Mediaverse, provided me with a graph that looked at the media coverage between 2015 and 2016. Now, this is a busy graph, so I'll highlight some points using the right clicker. So starting here at the beginning of 2015, we can see that there was a slight increase in media coverage for us and our competitors. It hit a peak in about July 2015. At that stage, there were about 800 pieces of coverage per competitor and us per month. By the time it got down to the end of December 2016, that had halved to about 400 pieces of coverage per competitor or us. In fact, it's an overall drop of about 24%. Per competitor, it was somewhere between 4% and 37%, 24% overall. Now, the reason that that's interesting is that what goes down, as we saw in media coverage, must come up somewhere else, theoretically. And it did exactly that, and that elsewhere was social media. So in what is almost a directly inverse graph, what we can see is that in 2014, actually 2012, where we had just over 2 million mentions on social media, this is for City globally, doesn't include the behemoth that is Facebook. From about 2 million mentions, we went up to about 6 million mentions. So it tripled over those years. So as we saw a decline in traditional coverage, we saw an incline in social media mentions. So why is this the case? Anybody that's familiar with the newsroom of yesteryear will not be surprised by this graph. That is a drop in full-time news people, journalists, in the US over 2013 to 2015. I mean, it's a pretty big drop. What that says is that there are fewer people out there, or fewer traditional full-time journalists to tell our story. If I put another inverse graph up, what it would probably say is that we have more aggregators, we have more curators, we have more mums and dads and community partners that are publishing on our behalf. So we're not seeing a drop in publishers, we're seeing a drop in the source of publishers. To the right is a little story that's been making the rounds. It's actually a big story in Australia. Fairfax Media is one of our largest media companies in Australia. For context, if you're familiar with News Corp, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, it's comparative, or they compete within our market. They've just made the news because they're reducing their journalists, their staff, by about 115, following a similar reduction in number last year. It's happening across the board. But once we broaden our scope of listening, we find something else. So this is the start of some of the analysis that we've been doing with our partner in looking at what's actually happening in social media and that convergence of social media and traditional media. I think if I had one slide that I put up today, this would be the one that really highlights that picture. The Financial Review, SMH, are both part of the Fairfax family that I just mentioned. Our biggest advocates on social media are part of the Fairfax family. So yes, we have other people talking about us as well, but we have traditional media moving into social media to drive traffic back to traditional media about us. Now, this is happening across the board, but organisations aren't drilling down far enough to see this. So they're assuming that it's just mums and dads complaining, in our case, that an ATM isn't working or that their card, they're stuck somewhere with their card not working. But the picture is actually much bigger than that, and the value to a senior level is much bigger than that as well. The reason that they do this is that social media has become a top traffic source for traditional media. What you have here, in fact, I'll start here. This is a New York Times graph. Drop in visits to homepages. So there was a time when media could put out a well-crafted article on the front page, and that's where people went first. In the social sharing economy, that's shifted somewhat, and people are deciding where they go. So whilst the homepage visits are reducing, people are still reading. In fact, we spend so much time online, 47% of it on social media. The rest of it, in my case anyway, I trawl news sites all day. It's my procrastination tool, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. That traffic is being driven by social media. So it's very important for media to be playing within social media to drive that traffic back. And we know that we need to be a part of that. So this all takes us to where we ended up, and that's that we understood that we needed to have an integrated approach to our media measurement strategy. I'll go into it a little bit further in terms of listening and monitoring, measuring and analysing. But what this graph shows you, and it's a great little piece from Edelman, is that we now, that whole ecosystem, actually encapsulates quite a few different pieces. It's not about picking up the paper at 7:30 in the morning, heading to the front page and seeing what's there. Now we're looking at who's talking about us, when they're talking about us, what they're saying, who the influencers are there other brands that are engaged, and how they're finding us. There is a whole ecosystem that's occurring that needs to form the strategy around our listening and measurement approach. Now, it's not just about what other people are saying. We can drive some of this traffic as well. So this is a nice little picture, I think, about what happens with earned and owned media. We talk about owned, earned, and shared media quite a lot. This is an example, a report we put out, not dissimilar to what we've done for years, except now we put it on our blog, on our owned media. We put it on our Twitter pages, we share it on our Facebook pages. And then we allow the influencers and the trusted sources to amplify that for us via social media. We have editors, we have journalists, we have community partners. Our piece of owned content sits on our platform, but is amplified by trusted sources as an earned piece of coverage. And that's what matters to us. The beast feeding the beast is what I call that circular thing that happens with traditional media seeking out sources in social media and writing about them. The amount of times, and I'm not the only one here, that I've seen a tweet and then woken up the next morning to see 600 words to 1,000 words on that very tweet, a full-length feature story, it's too many to mention. We can even, the situation with Trump and Hillary, the support of Hillary in the mainstream media was significantly greater than Trump in mainstream media. But whatever Trump put out ended up going into mainstream media as well. His message was being amplified by the very people that weren't necessarily sitting in his corner. The reason this is important is that we need to build relationships. We need to continue to build relationships with journalists, but we need to know what's in there, what's being said about us. Two pieces here. I've put these two examples up because they're, for me, a reference point on headlines. We've always looked at full articles and what's being said about us in the full articles. What's important today is that 80% of people will only read the headline. And I know that fact because I read it in a headline. They don't drill down further into the actual article. 59% will share based on what's on the headline. In this case, where we were mentioned, the word Islam was included in the headline. It became the largest read story at the time for that publication. When we drilled down to understand why, it was because the word Islam was in there and Reddit shares everything with the word Islam in it. Citibank refunds $5 million of international transfers. That actually started off as Citibank was fined $5 million. We caught it early. We got them to change the headline because that story is very different if it's out there incorrectly as a headline, despite the context within it. Just a few weeks ago, the reason I put this slide up is that one of the things that we do is we analyse at the end, but we listen on a daily basis. This is just a recent example of a peak in traffic around a topic. We put out a research report that said that property prices would be dropping by 7%. I could tell at this point here that it was increasing in volume. I could then inform our sales guys that this was becoming a hot topic and they had a small window of opportunity to do something with that. It peaked for a few days and came down, but that became article after article after article. In my naivety, I believe that that's because it became so widely shared. Everybody wanted to hop onto the bandwagon. Which takes me to where we ended up with our converged social media strategy. One of the questions that I had last night from people that was mentioned a few times is, we all know that there's a problem, but how do we solve it? And the way that we solved it was to align our traditional reporting with our social reporting. What that meant was that we needed to have a look at the quantitative and the qualitative measures and align them with each other. Now, this is one of those answers, and that is to be able to take to the senior to the decision makers in organisations valuable data that they already understand, that they know helps inform their decisions and their strategies, and give that to them in the big picture. In this case, what we do for this particular report is we provide an analysis of top tweeters, their influencers, and what they're talking about. A couple of things to highlight. Lots of people talking about us. We can't analyse all of them because we're limited in budget like all of your clients are or all of our businesses are. The reach, however, is enormous. So we know, we can go back and say when something goes out, these stories, these topics, these key messages are having an influence because this is the scope of the audience. This one's really important. Our key message delivery. So our key messages might include that we're serving our clients, that we're leaders in banking, that we support our partners in their pathways to progress. Traditionally, that's what we've measured. Now, most people at a senior level will assume that social media is people talking about sharing cat videos or talking about their kids or all of that. What we're able to identify and provide them with is the knowledge that what's being said on social media is not dissimilar to what's being said in traditional media. We're hitting the same key messages on social as we are in traditional. We can look at our favourability, and anybody in this room that's looked at sentiment knows that it is impossible to analyse sentiment through machine spitting out information. There needs to be analysis behind it because of the nuances in language that we need to understand. But it gives us a solid picture. Another hugely important thing for us to have been able to communicate to our executive team is that offshore coverage actually has a big impact on local coverage. So we sit in Australia, we've got our nice little bubble and we can do our marketing campaigns and have our partner programs, but something happens over in the US, or it happens in Hong Kong, or it happens in Indonesia. I mean, social media is global. There will be people that sit within our countries talking about those topics. And what we found is that 50% of offshore coverage makes its way over into onshore coverage. Very important for our executive teams to know as they're making their decisions. A couple of examples is this one. City lending for Dakota Access Pipeline. I should have asked before, please don't tweet this picture. If you have, it's too late, but it's one that we use internally. The Dakota Access Pipeline is something that we supported the lending for in the US, and locally that became a huge thing on social media, but it did not spill over into traditional media. So we're able to measure by lining the two up together what's happening online, what's happening in traditional, and where that crossover is occurring. Earned media versus owned media is another interesting point. And it's interesting because there's a small component of what we do that is owned, but the vast majority of conversation that we're listening to and picking up on is earned. One of my final slides is when we look at our executive team, there's a broad range of people. We've got people responsible for compliance, we've got people responsible for marketing or for consumer business, people responsible for corporate messaging, people responsible for our institutional banking group that you would not expect to see on social media. By drilling down and doing the analysis, what we can tell them is, hey, Miss So-and-so in market commentary, did you know that 22% of online conversation is about your area? Hey, corporate people, did you know that 47% of what's being said online in this month, which was February, was around our corporate messaging? We can then break it down further and give them more information. Of course, marketing wants to know what people are saying about the campaigns. Servicing wants to know what people are saying about the products and the services. And we can drill down and start to get them a little bit excited about this unknown space. I'm going to leave you with the final slide. My previous point is that they need to have information relevant to their area to be interested. Social media is a big, big beast, and you need to break it down to a business head with metrics that suit their needs. Senior level executives, marketing, public relations, sales, servicing, etc. Social media cuts across the full value chain. They're going to have different metrics. Marketing will be looking for ROI, product will be looking for product information. Where you focus, where you deliver your measurement needs, and where it comes from, needs to suit what they're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you, Di. That was great. There's got to be some questions on that, some very good content in there. So I'm looking for a hand.
Hi.
Hello.
That was fabulous, thank you.
Thank you.
With your dashboard, you mentioned, and linking to Jamin's comment earlier on about measuring sentiment and the importance of using kind of a human overlay to check the accuracy. But is there a challenge with the sheer volume of coverage you have to deal with? I noticed the volumes between mainstream and social are actually quite similar. So have you had to filter down the social at all?
Yes, so for that particular dashboard, we look at our top 400 tweets for the month based purely on reach of those that are tweeting. So that informs that information for that particular dashboard. And it's not possible at this stage for us to go beyond that. In fact, if I could sacrifice some of my wage to get them to analyse more, I would, because I can see the value in it. So the short answer is that we will narrow down depending on the audience. This is for our exco, and it works for them to have a big picture view that cuts across the franchise. We do social listening, for example, on forums. We don't respond, but the information from that helps inform product decisions, because that's peer-to-peer conversations that we can pull out and give to our product guys about what people are saying about our conversations. It's not analysed, it's verbatim. So there are instances where it's verbatim and where there's large amounts. Because of need, we narrow it down for the analysis. I'll give you a short piece of info. I was considered an influencer back in about 2000, when I was young and hip, in about 2011. And when I looked at my clout score, which is what you look at to see, how cool, how big your number is, I was an influencer in World of Warcraft. Now, I've never played World of Warcraft, but I use WoW a lot in my tweets. So that's a very, very good example of needing full context to actually understand what's being said.
Question at the back, please. A microphone.
And as an Australian, I speak very quickly, so I apologise.
Hi, I'm Diego from, can you hear me? I'm Diego from Prime Research. Thank you for the great presentation.
Thank you.
Considering that there's a very active, very interesting social media community on Twitter in particular in the world of finance and banking, I was wondering, do you do any analysis about the interplay between social and traditional media, and do you target some of the influencers specifically on social media?
Well, it's a very good question, and we do. So we have, for example, journalism awards every year, and it's very independent. In fact, our winner 2 years ago was someone that wrote a critical story about Citi, so very independent. But the way that we engage with our journalists, and we try to build up a follower of journalists on Twitter, is that we talk about them on Twitter leading up to the journalism awards. We share the winners, and because they like to, say congratulations to each other, they end up amplifying that message, and we get more and more journalists following us. So we don't do things like share a press release on Twitter, but we do try and make sure that we're building up a following, so as we're putting out our messages, however they're coming through, that information is there for them to see. We also try and mention them in our tweets. Our global handle has, I think, 1 million followers now, so if there's a local story that's worth sharing globally, we'll get them tagged into that. And what that means is that they will then also follow that lead and mention us when they're putting out their stories.
Has to be a quick one, Colin. One question, please.
I like these questions, Barry.
Yeah, but Colin's a multiple question expert.
I just had to look this up, but I was at a conference a few years ago where I was speaking with another lady called Anna O'Brien, who worked at Citibank in the US. And she was at that conference, and we're talking about 6 years ago. She was talking about the challenges she had with the confidence in senior management and legal in allowing interaction and participation with customers for Citibank. Has that just gone away, or is there still nervousness? Is there still sort of quite a strong framework you have to follow?
So I think by default, senior leaders in organisations, particularly banking, are a little bit scared of social media because they don't understand it and they think everything is going to blow up. What I find is probably the opposite locally, in that I'll get emails almost daily, hey Di, what are we doing with this particular customer and what can we do to change something? So we just had a case 2 days ago where our head of business offered to call a customer because he was interested in the feedback he was giving. So that same head of business, when we first sent that dashboard to Exco, shared it with his team and said, look at this fabulous report on what's happening. And I think the way that we can move people out of fear is to show them what's actually happening in line with their metrics and in line with their KPIs. So by doing that, I think we've removed the fear, maybe a little bit too much.
I was going to say a lot's changed in 6 years. It's good to see, and just shows the value of transparency.
One more thing, if I can say it, and this is probably important as well, is that I sit in City Australia and I lead social media within corporate affairs. Now, someone mentioned before about getting a seat at the table. By having social media sit within corporate affairs, you can influence that level. Now, my background cuts across marketing and ops, and so I understand what everybody is trying to do, and I am best placed to be able to push up the need for measurement, the need for analysis, the need for a few extra dollars, and I can also push down other metrics that support the other practitioners' and functions' needs. I think if you can find people or organisations with social media heads within corporate affairs, they're going to do half the work for you.
This time we really do have to say goodbye reluctantly. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.